Tonight on Chronicle.
Now, when Bob was at Exeter, I wanted to visit him, make sure he was buckling down with his studies.
It was 1860 when a dad with presidential aspirations came to New Hampshire to visit his son at school.
He would have gotten off the train there and most likely walked up Front Street. He could have hired a carriage, but probably didn't. Lincoln was known to be a walker.
The impact of Abraham Lincoln's visit to the town of Exeter and the impact Exeter had on him.
The way the man spoke, the way that he laid out his arguments was just magical. So it must have been an amazing night.
There was a great deal of momentum. The party would unite behind him, as would the delegates who would put him over the top at the Chicago Convention just several months later.
Plus, Fritz Weatherby's New Hampshire.
Abraham Lincoln did not have a deep, booming voice, but nonetheless, he was a master at speaking. I'll tell you the story on New Hampshire Chronicle.
That's next on Chronicle.
The learning there was like the place, playing rudiments with little grace.
'Twas reading, writing, arithmetic, the books were hard and heads were thick.
Memories of the old schoolhouse. Almost every town had one, and a visit to your local historical society can bring those days to life again.
A case in point, the collection here at the Somersworth Historical Society, and there is stuff dating back in the schools all the way back to the very beginning. I'm standing here in an area of old traditional stuff from way back in the 1920s.
Desks and photographs. I even have, Tom, an old intercom system from the 1905 high school here in town.
Lots of yearbooks, good stuff here if you're interested in the topper stuff.
By the way, what was your favorite subject in high school?
Cafeteria.
How about presidential history?
Oh, yeah.
Well, it goes without saying that U.S. presidents don't get to Washington without first passing through New Hampshire.
Now, we probably take that for granted in these parts, but not the town of Exeter, and not when that hopeful was Abraham Lincoln.
It was exactly 150 years ago this week that Lincoln arrived, in part to visit his son, who was a student at the academy.
But while he was here, his speeches to more than 6,000 citizens helped propel him to his party's nomination.
Exeter is celebrating that visit all this week. So come with us and learn about the impact the 16th president had on New Hampshire and the impact it had on him.
Ladies and gentlemen, I bring you all greetings from Washington City. It has been many years since I last visited your fair state of New Hampshire.
Abraham Lincoln interpreter Steve Wood stays in character as he visits schools like Kensington Elementary, hearkening back to 1860 when the real Abe, not yet our president, came here because of another school. Lincoln was an Illinois lawyer at the time, but had served in Congress with Amos Tuck of Exeter. It was Tuck who suggested Phillips Exeter Academy as a school for Lincoln's oldest boy.
It really was Lincoln's attempt to give his oldest son, the only son who survived, into full adulthood. The other three boys all died, one in infancy, one while Lincoln was in the White House, and a third in his teenage years. Robert Todd was the only one to make it through to all adulthood, but the main thing was Lincoln wanted to give his sons all the benefit of the formal education that he himself had lacked.
Now, when Bob was at Exeter, I wanted to visit him and make sure he was buckling down with his studies.
An invitation to speak at Cooper Union in New York City gave him the opportunity. Lincoln had lost the 1858 Illinois Senate election to Stephen Douglas, but his position against slavery during their debates gained lots of attention. The powerful speech at Cooper Union paid him $200, paving the way for the trip to see Bob and securing his political future.
We feel that his trip eastward helped propel him towards getting the Republican candidacy for president.
The Exeter Historical Society has developed a fourth-grade Lincoln Pocket Project that includes what he might have carried as he arrived on Front Street on February 29, 1860.
He would have gotten off the train there and most likely walked up Front Street. He could have hired a carriage, but probably didn't. Lincoln was known to to be a walker. And we know that his son and his son's roommate, George Latham, met him at the station. And he was also met by a group of Republicans from the state who asked him to speak in various locations. They would have come right past Phillips Exeter Academy, where Robert was attending school. I'm sure they would have spotted that. Robert would have pointed it out to his father and shown him what it looked like. They would have come down to where he may have stayed at the Squamscott Hotel or the Squamscott House. So he would have seen all of those sites.
Lincoln brought Bob and his friend with him to speeches at Phoenix Hall in Concord, and he spoke in Manchester and Dover over the next few days.
He was refining his Cooper Union address everywhere he went and speaking quite forcibly about the need to stop the extension of slavery.
His last speech here was on March 3rd to an overflowing crowd at the Exeter Town Hall.
The interior was this big open space, sort of like a barn, no heating in the inside. And he gave his speech in early March, so it's maybe in the 40s outside, but the place was packed. So many people came from surrounding towns. The newspaper accounts say there was even a sprinkling of women there. Women didn't vote back then.
Accounts describe him as a tall, thin, strange-looking man, an impression that changed dramatically when people heard what he had to say.
You see, slavery is like a snake that crawls into bed where children are sleeping. The problem is, how do you deal with the snake without harming the children? Now say if, for example, I was to find a rattlesnake out on the street or in the field or out in the prairie. Well, I'd take a stake and I'd kill it. Now people would applaud the act and say I did right. But suppose that snake had slithered into bed where children were sleeping. Would I do right to strike it there? I might not kill, but only arouse and exasperate the snake, and it might bite the children. So it may not be safe to abolish slavery where it already exists in our states, or we might destroy ourselves in so doing. But let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us dare to do our duty as we understand it.
The way the man spoke, the way that he laid out his arguments was just magical. So it must have been an amazing night.
Behind Lincoln's sharp political message was a devoted family man, as evidenced by the letter he wrote to his wife Mary that Sunday. He talked about going to church with Bob, hanging out with the boys in their boarding house, and he worried about young Tad and Willie, who he'd heard were sick. He barely mentioned his speeches, though he gave a dozen in his 2 weeks in New England.
It was an amazing tour de force. It approximates a kind of whistle-stop campaign, a New Hampshire primary campaign. The New Hampshire group, along with his whole New England voyage, gave him tremendous support and tremendous backing. And, of course, the financial support that he needed to overcome the lead of William Seward, who had been kind of decreed as the early nominee of the Republican Party for the election of 1860. There was a great deal of momentum. The party would unite behind him, as would the delegates who would put him over the top at the Chicago Convention just several months later.
This week's sesquicentennial celebration includes tours of relevant Lincoln sites, along with exhibits, speakers, and children's activities, a Civil War-era band concert, and of course, Lincoln himself speaking at the Exeter Town Hall. Up next, the legacy and the Gettysburg Address.
A new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
Abraham Lincoln arrived in Exeter in the winter of 1860 to visit his son, who was a student at Phillips Exeter Academy. He made nearly a dozen speeches while he was in New England that many feel provided the momentum for his election as our 16th president.
I'm always intrigued by when you get local history that becomes transformational. And there's no question this is a transformational event for Exeter, for Phillips Exeter Academy, for the state of New Hampshire, for the region of New England, and finally, of course, because of Lincoln's remarkable service in keeping the Republic together during the Civil War, the nation, state as a whole.
I was asked once to make a few appropriate remarks at the dedication of a national cemetery in the battlefield town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Many brave soldiers had died there just 5 months earlier. It was a quiet place now, with rows and rows of graves. And I wanted to remind people of the larger meaning of this war. My speech wasn't long, not even 3 minutes, and at first I felt that perhaps some people were disappointed with it. But later, when they thought about what I said that day, they began to appreciate what I was trying to say. I'd like to conclude my talk to you this morning by reading to you now that speech. That day at Gettysburg, the audience was standing. They had just stood for over 2 hours listening to the main oration. I'd like to ask you to stand while I read to you now that speech. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work, which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Thank you.